Welcome back, YouTubers. This is the yellow Yamaha QT50 on the workbench. I figured I'd make a video to help people who are just learning how to make repairs on these bikes or just starting repairs on these bikes. I guess the first 3 rules of working on your notepad. Number 1, get it in a well-lit room or area. I don't even know if that's number 1. Maybe number 1 should be get it off the ground. It's a lot easier to work on up here than down there. And then number 3 would be probably get it out of the weather. So you're not working on it in the hot sun or in the cold wind or in the rain or whatever. Get it inside. So get it lit, get it up, and get it in. It's going to make life a lot easier. I can't drink tea right-handed and do this. Okay, it looks like I'm taking out the exhaust bolts because I'm going to take that exhaust off, because I think, if I remember correctly, I'm going to remove that rear tire. Okay, the exhaust bolts are a trap for the unwary. Usually they're the rustiest parts on the bike, and they will snap in half on you in an instant. And if they snap in half on you, it'll seem like the end of the world if you have no experience removing snapped off studs from your cylinder jug. So be very careful when you remove those exhaust bolts. I think there's some videos on YouTube. I know there are videos on YouTube on how to remove rusty exhaust bolts. One way is to slowly work them back and forth. Tighten, untighten, tighten, untighten. But there's no guarantee there. Another way is, when it doesn't look good, stop. Don't break it and go to someone who knows. Heat might help as well. So anyhow, to get the exhaust off, there's the 2 bolts that connect to the cylinder jug, and then there's the 2 bolts that connect kind of to the frame. And then I usually take the rear fender off to make life a little easier. And so far, these should all be 10mm bolts, unless someone has switched them. I guess I'm putting on a new back tire. And then, I don't know, I'm going to go with memory here. That nut holding the wheel on, I think, is 19mm. But I forget. And if you're going to service the back brakes, you need to do all this anyways. That looks pretty close to 19. A long socket wrench is always helpful here. Get a little leverage on it. And then to get the wheel off, you'll need to loosen up the rear brakes, either at the handlebars or at the wheel. I already ripped my gloves. Now, I guess rule number 4, it's helpful to have gloves, especially if you're messing around with gas and oil. Plus, these bikes get messy real easily. So here I am loosening the back brakes. And there you can see the rear wheel coming right off, or maybe you can't. And there's the brake pads. You see them there. I think I'm just switching the tire. Anyhow, the fun thing about putting on new brakes is doing so with that heavy-duty spring. But that'll have to be for another video. This gets you almost all the way to the start and finish of the brake repair job. The only thing is missing is taking those off and slapping new ones on. Where's that tire? I think I'm putting on a new tire here. I've had this video in the hopper for a while, and it's a long one. It's always, now is always a good time to clean up, because you have access to stuff that you haven't had access to in a long time. I'd kind of gone over this and cleaned it up, you know, decent, the engine and stuff. Nothing like a toothbrush and some simple green cleaner. And if you're changing the transmission oil, it's always, you don't have to, but it's always helpful to remove the exhaust, because it'll drain. With the exhaust on, it'll drain and drip all over the exhaust. So I usually just take the exhaust off to deal with the transmission oil. To clean the fenders, I just use some simple green. If you want to take it to the next step, you can get a magic eraser. Those work wonderful on those white fenders. And if you want to take it to the next step, you can do a little car wax after that. And if you want to go to the next step, you can replace those screws with Allen bolts. I think I put on a new kickstart rubber there. Found those on eBay recently for $6 each shipped, so I bought a couple. Should have bought more. I think the seller might have sold out of them. They were such a good deal. Where is that new tire at? Oh, I might be taking it off another one. I was waiting on my order of IRC NC77 tires, and Bike Bandit, which is normally really good about shipping, held them for over a week, maybe a week and a half before they even shipped the things. And they didn't ship them until I submitted a trouble ticket saying, hey, when are you going to ship these things? So my deadline was approaching, so I ended up just taking a wheel with a new tire off another bike and putting it on here, which wasn't the end of the world. Of course, my order showed up, what was it, 3 or 4 days after my deadline, but oh well. Okay, for some reason I noticed that I lost my voiceover when I was watching this on YouTube again, so I'm going to try to recreate that voiceover now. Try to make it a little less boring and make it a little more fast-paced. I'm watching the YouTube video going, man, this is pretty slow stuff. But, you know, I guess repairing these things does have a sort of a soothing effect until you run into a problem. Anyhow, one of the things I know I talked about was, and I've talked about it in other videos, is the rear fender and the importance of keeping it on. Here you can see with the wheel and exhaust and rear fender off, all the areas that are exposed if you were to leave the rear fender off the bike. You'd be kicking up mud, dirt, grime, rocks, whatever, all over your air filter, carburetor, oil pump, backside of your engine, underside of your gas tank, throttle housing, as well as the back of the frame. So, you know, I'll repeat it. I always forget to say it, but now I've started to remember. You know, always put the back fender back on. I guess what happens is people do a tire repair. They lose a couple of the bolts that hold the fender in place, and then they just decide, well, I'll get to it later or whatever. And they never get to it. They lose the fender, and they end up running without it for the rest of the time they own the bike. And then whoever gets the bike next, the thing is just a complete mess. And that's happened to me with several bikes that I bought. They're just a complete mess, and they end up rusting out a lot quicker and have problems. The carburetor's a disaster. The back of the engine's a disaster. It's just no fun. So run the bike with the back fender, the rear fender, and then I'm often in the same boat where I get to a certain point in a repair and I've got to stop because of, you know, whatever, lack of time, or I'm missing a part or what have you. It's always a good idea. Sandwich bags are really helpful, and maybe several sandwich bags, and take a Sharpie and mark them. But if you take bolts and other hardware off, for example, the rear fender, sandwich bag them up and take a Sharpie and write on it, you know, rear fender, and then put them in a safe place. That way, when you get back, or tape it to the bike, tape the sandwich bag to the bike with some packing tape or other strong tape. That way, when you get back to the repair, you've got all the parts ready to go. There's nothing like, you know, you always think you're going to get back to the repair a day later or something, and then a week or two passes, and then you're like, where are all my parts to put this back together? And that's just a huge issue. And, you know, that's often why I imagine the rear fender just disappears on these bikes. Plus, with the Honda Express, for example, finding that rear fender bracket that attaches the rear fender to the intake can be difficult and costly on eBay. I've gotten lucky a few times and purchased it for like $8 or something like that on bikes that I had to replace the rear fender on. And then same thing on the Honda Express, they want a fortune for that rear fender. Sometimes up to like $50 and more, just to get a used rear fender that's probably of some color that doesn't even match the bike. Luckily, I found out that with little ingenuity, you can take a QT50 rear or front fender and adapt it to work on the Honda Express. So, I know a lot of times the hard part about repairs is just getting started. You don't know where to start. And this video is just to give you some idea on how to go about getting started. You know, I'm just replacing a wheel here, but you can easily branch this out into several other repairs, like replacing the exhaust gasket, or changing the transmission oil, or changing the rear brakes. I've showed you how to loosen the rear brakes, and to tighten them, you just turn that nut in. Here's the new tire. I've probably mentioned this in several other videos. This is the IRC NC77 tire, 70/80. So that means it's 70 millimeters wide with an aspect ratio of 80. The aspect ratio is the ratio of the, I think it's the width to the height of the tire. And this is 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch wider than the stock tire. And because of that aspect ratio, it's going to be taller than the stock tire. And as I mentioned before, one of the best upgrades you can do to any of these bikes is to just go ahead and replace the tires when you get the bike. And as I've promised before, I will make a tire replacement video, hopefully soon. And with a new tire, obviously the traction's better, the handling and the braking are going to be better as well. The ride is going to be significantly better. As a matter of fact, you know, the before and after riding this on the stock tires versus this one, I mean, it's just a huge difference in the ride, in my opinion. And I think there's an even bigger IRC tire that would fit, but you'll probably have to lose the rear fender, which, like I said, is not a good idea, or somehow modify the rear fender with an 80/90. The IRC NC77 80/90, so it's 80 millimeters thick. So another 10 millimeters, I should say not thick, but wider. You can also put the tire I just put on the rear on the front, but you're going to have to play with the fender stays to get it to work right, and raise up the fender a bit as well. Anyhow, here I'm putting the exhaust back on. Those are two 12 millimeter bolts there. And then the 10 millimeter bolts underneath the where the exhaust attaches to the cylinder. Generally, you just want to get these, still leave them a little loose, and then put the other ones on. And then you don't want to over tighten the bolts that attach to the cylinder. That's a good way to snap them in half, as I've done on at least 2 occasions, which, as I talked about at the beginning of the video, is not fun. And then a good idea is either to replace those bolts right there that I'm working with now with new ones, and use anti-seize on either the new, or if you're just going to reuse the old ones, on the old. A good glop of anti-seize compound is awesome, and it'll make the next time you go about removing the exhaust a lot easier. Or if this bike goes to somebody else, you're doing them a huge favor. And I think I'd already put some on there because I'd removed the exhaust before. I probably ought to put a little bit on each time I do it, I guess, just to be anal about it. But and I forget if those are new bolts or not, but that's just a great idea there. And then, like I said, do not over tighten this. I should be using a torque wrench. I'd have to check the specs. Off the top of my head, maybe 9 foot-pounds or 8 foot-pounds. But do not over tighten those exhaust bolts that attach to the cylinder, or that will cause you all kinds of headaches and gnashing of teeth. what are we doing now? Here, oh, I got the torque wrench out. This is another. This is your. I've been through the school of hard knocks. I first got this torque wrench, and I really didn't know how to use it. Well, the key to using a torque wrench is to gradually step up the torque to get to where you want to go. So for example, those cylinder head nuts are 84 inch-pounds or 7 foot-pounds each. And this torque wrench is in, see it, hear it click? There you go. That means you've reached whatever torque spec you've dialed up on that wrench. And the other trick is you want to, when you tighten a nut or bolt, you want to do it very slowly so that you can distinctly hear and feel the click. So the first time I got that torque wrench, I wasn't going that slowly. I was going quite a bit quicker, and I could never feel or hear the click. So I kept thinking, what's the deal? So I kept tightening and tightening and tightening the nut on the cylinder head, and I ended up breaking the stud. Oh man, you talk about a nightmare. You thought the exhaust bolt is hard to drill out? Well, that stud is even harder to drill out. It usually breaks inside the cylinder head, or I'm sorry, that stud goes all the way back into the engine, so it usually breaks inside the engine. And it wasn't even my bike. I was working on a friend's bike, and I thought I'd just, hey, let's go the extra mile here and torque up the cylinder head nuts, and I ended up breaking the stud. So I spent like 2 or 3 days screwing with it, trying to drill out that stud. I think I already had a Dremel, but then I had to go buy several different Dremel bits to figure out what worked best on drilling out that stud. What a nightmare that was. So, School of Hard Knocks. You can avoid a lesson from the School of Hard Knocks by listening to me, Andy, on how to do this properly. And, oh, I took out the spark plug here. As I've mentioned in other videos, people often throw any old spark plug in here that'll screw in. That doesn't mean that it'll work for this bike. This bike is designed to work on the NGK BP. Hell, let's just pull one out. NGK BP 4HS or 5HS, or if you've got oh man, or if you've upgraded to like a 60cc kit or a high compression head, or done other modifications, you can run an even colder plug. As the number gets higher, the plug gets colder. Hotter plugs make it easier to start, and also make it run less rich. Colder plugs actually draw some heat away from the engine and help cool it down maybe a tiny bit. I think I've read somewhere as much as like 20 degrees per change in or step increase in plug. So if you went from a 4 to a 5, they say 15 to 20 degrees or something like that. I read somewhere. I don't know if I believe that, but I guess I'd have to do a little more research on it, maybe some field testing myself. Generally on the stock engine, I run a 4 or 5 plug. You can experiment. You could try a 6 plug on this and see what that would do. And then what I'm hooking up here is a temp gauge just to see what this is running at. And this one actually ran hotter than I expected. It was up around, I think, 379 degrees. Of course, I was riding on pretty hot days, 90 degrees plus. But in the fall and winter, I imagine it would run cooler with cooler air temperatures outside. Also, when you experience a drop in outdoor temperature, like, it's been in the 90s and now it's in the 70s or 60s, your bike is going to run leaner in colder weather because cold makes the air more dense. So in effect, it's getting more air when it's colder outside than when it's hotter outside. So just you might have to make a carburetor adjustment or a jetting adjustment, depending on the air temperature. But really, you probably wouldn't have to do anything unless you're, probably a 30 or 40 degree temperature drop. You might have to go that far. But you'll probably notice a difference in performance of the bike with just maybe a 20 degree temperature drop. So I'm just hooking up that temp gauge. They also make a tack very similar to that. And it just attaches to the spark plug. You remove the spark plug washer, and this thing has a copper connector that looks just like a spark plug washer, and you just screw the spark plug in and fit it into the cylinder head there. It's got little spaces where you can fit it in easier, and you can tell what the temperature is at the cylinder head. Which may or may not accurately reflect what the temperature is in other parts of the engine. As a matter of fact, it probably doesn't reflect what the temperature is in other parts of the engine. Like, for example, down near the exhaust port, it's probably going to be even hotter than this thing is reporting at the cylinder head. Of course, one of the flaws of this bike is the extremely small cylinder head. Let's look at it right there. They could have made one, 50% larger, no problem. And that would have helped with cooling that engine a lot better. And you can go out and find cylinder heads that have been custom made for this bike for the bigger engine kits. One of my problems with a lot of the big bore kits sold on eBay is they sell basically the same cylinder head, except that it's been reworked to work with a slightly wider piston. So you've got instead of a 50cc engine, you've got a 60cc engine, but the cylinder head has remained the same size. I'll see you too. So that's just a cheap way of doing it. Basically China. I'm sure those things come from China. Took the easy way out, and my suspicion is I got people sending me text messages. Come on, man. I'm busy. I'm doing important stuff here. Don't bother me with your phone calls, text messages, blah, blah, blah. It's like, jeez, man. I'm almost done. As a matter of fact, I just got a little more time. But, they should have gone the extra mile and made a cylinder head with more cooling area. they didn't hear. Anyhow, hope that this helps you out a little bit with your QT50 repairs, and I'll see if I can't make more videos here soon. Thanks for watching, and ride safe.